Hi, my name is Renata Field and I'm the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Domestic Violence New South Wales. I'm really happy to be with you at the conference here and excited to be speaking to you about the issue of coercive control. But before we get started, I'd like to firstly just acknowledge that wherever we are, we're meeting on Aboriginal land and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal folks that are in the meeting today. And I'd like to particularly pay respects to the traditional owners of the Darawal Nation, where I am joining you from. Now, I'll try and share my screen if I can. So many of you will be familiar with this content, but I did want to just mention that if this topic brings anything up for you or you need support, there's support out there in the form of many services and specialists, but of course the 24/7 numbers which can provide support, including 1-800-RESPECT. And it's always good to know and remember that 1-800-RESPECT also provides support for workers in the space if you're feeling any signs of vicarious trauma, or for friends and family who need support on how they support another person in their close sphere. So encourage you to step out and do that if you need to. So today we'll be speaking about coercive control, and I guess it's important to start by working out what that is. I think, again, most of you will be familiar with it. It's been spoken about quite a lot frequently in recent times when we're speaking about domestic and family violence. A lot of the writing about it has been brought together by an academic called Evan Stark, who speaks about 4 key kind of aspects of coercive control, which include violence, intimidation, which includes threats, surveillance, degradation, withholding money. The third one is isolation and control. That can principally look like micro-regulation of everyday behaviours, and the institution of rules. So I really see coercive control as a fundamental part of most types of domestic and family violence. It institutes a huge amount of fear and is very pervasive. We know that it occurs in most types of domestic and family violence relationships. This is a quote from a victim survivor. "It's taken me many years of being out of the abusive relationship to understand that I experienced coercive control. Because there was no physical evidence, it was like it didn't happen. However, in dealing with the psychological effects I experienced, I've come to understand how bad it was and how deeply I was and am still affected." Coercive control, of course, has a huge impact on many people, which is why we're trying to create better systems that can support people who are experiencing it. So I wanted to speak to you a little bit about the context of coercive control and why we're talking about it so much at the minute. It's been talked about, it's not a new phenomenon, it's been talked about for decades. And I think it's important to speak about the history of feminist and intersexual feminist activism, which has created such a strong focus on domestic and family violence and on non-physical forms of violence as well, which is, I think, important note that coercive control is sometimes talked about as emotional abuse, but it's important to note that it does intersect really strongly with other forms of harm, such as sexual violence and physical violence. And sometimes, of course, there are more emotional forms of violence utilised, but often they coexist together. So it's impossible really to separate them into certain types solely. But it is important to note that there's been many decades of activism bringing these issues to the fore and to be getting the credibility and interest and information out into the community that we see today. It's also important to commend and note the work of Evan Stark, who has really brought to the fore a lot of that feminist thinking over the decades. And he's been one of the leading kind of academics working internationally to bring that thought together. And that has led to legislative changes in a number of different countries. I also wanted to mention in Australia, what happened as a result of that activism was the protection order legislation. So that legislation, it sits alongside other types of criminal acts, and most of you will be familiar with it, but for those who aren't, what it means is that people can get a protection order without having to reach a criminal proof of harm, so that something has happened beyond reasonable doubt. And in New South Wales, people can get a protection order with the police acting as their, I guess, the person who's acting for their responsibility, so that the person who's being harmed is not seen to be vexatious, or that it's their fault that the protection order has been taken out. So that whole system was actually created to deal with complex forms of violence, such as coercive control, in that it has the flexibility to understand a diverse number of types of harm, and for them to come to some sort of a legal space without having to reach that criminal threshold. And of course, when an AVO is breached, as you know, that then becomes the criminal act, which can then be penalised. So I think it's important to see that protection order legislation as part of the decades of activism that have come towards creating protections for people who are experiencing violence. In the Australian context, there is another jurisdiction which has coercive control in their criminal legislation, and that's in Tasmania. That was introduced over 15 years ago, and there's been lots of debate about why it hasn't been utilised as well as it maybe could have, and that's predominantly seen to be about training and information of the police force, but it could also, others say that it's more about the specific wording that is in that particular crime. However, it's important to know that it is in one jurisdiction in Australia, and in other jurisdictions, they have the wording of coercive control or controlling behaviour more clearly in their civil legislation, so around protection orders, such as in Victoria, where it's quite clearly written that and includes behaviours that we see in coercive and controlling relationships. And then if we look more broadly, coercive control legislation was introduced in the UK in 2015 and in Wales, and then in Ireland and Scotland in 2018. And there's been quite a lot of press about that, particularly in Australia. I think that's has a lot to do with the fantastic book, See What You Made Me Do by Jess Hill. So she's really brought to light the issue of coercive control on top of, as I said, decades of activism by people with lived experience and services and supporters. But what we've seen internationally is the introduction of this legislation in a number of jurisdictions, which is useful for us to compare and contrast. And the Scottish model, I think, is generally seen as the gold standard because they had quite a long lead up to it. They had a lot of consultation, and they did a huge amount of work in the police force to create some of those cultural changes that I think we need to see in order to introduce it in a way that will be most successful. So in the New South Wales context, what we saw was the New South Wales DVDRT, the Domestic Violence Death Review Team report, which is a biannual report that looks at all of the murders in domestic context in New South Wales. And they found that the majority of domestic violence murders happened in the context of coercive control. And because of this issue, there was more that needed to be done to respond. So the Attorney General announced an inquiry last year, and that happened over a number of months with many organisations and individuals providing information and submissions. Many of you may have participated. And then the inquiry produced a report in June 2021, which collated their findings. We're expecting that the government will respond in December. There's also quite a lot happening in the federal space. So there's a national plan which is about to be released next year as the successor national plan to end violence against women and their children. It may have a new name, the successor plan, we'll see. But as part of that and through the consultations, there's been quite a lot of discussion about coercive control. So it will be interesting to see what happens in that space. But in the meantime, there has been set up a group to develop a set of principles, and the principles are to guide the states and territories in their response and legislative reform to address coercive control. So in response to the inquiry, DV New South Wales did a survey of our members, and we found that the majority of our members and victim survivors supported coercive control if there was thorough consultation, suitable training, and resourcing for the domestic and family violence sector. So it's fantastic to see that most people agree that legislation in this space would be useful, but there are a lot of ifs, of course, that it's done well and that people are trained to use it well. And of course, that the sector surrounding that legislation is supported so that they can provide the necessary framework to support people who've experienced violence. In the member survey, we asked, in your experience, do police generally act diligently regarding domestic and family violence? And this is the response from members. So about 8% said yes, and you'll find the majority said no, but many also said sometimes. But I think this is concerning, particularly if we're asking police to police a new type of abuse, which is more complex and nuanced, potentially without any additional resources. So we'll see now what the victim survivors said. Unfortunately, the results were even more scathing. So only 3% said that they believe police generally act diligently. And that was a sample size of about 180 victim survivors. So unfortunately, not great results with police there. So I think that what DV New South Wales is advocating for is that if legislation is introduced, it's really done in a very thorough way that has some of the best parts of what we're calling the gold standard model in Scotland, such as the years of lead up and police cultural change to create those improvements that we'd like to see. So we came up with a number of different recommendations in our submission, and I'll just talk through them and then mention a few things along the way. So the number one thing really was increasing the funding to the specialist domestic and family violence sector to ensure that women, children, sexuality and gender diverse people impacted by domestic and family violence receive effective specialist support, including those who choose not to seek redress via the criminal justice system. So I think it's important to note that only 1 in 10 or even less of people who've experienced domestic and family violence actually seek support, let alone through police. So when we're speaking about reforms and actions to address domestic and family violence, we need to be cognizant of the whole community. Of course, legal reform does provide a way that we can educate people and provides obviously justice for many people, but it's important to note the breadth and depth of responses and that many people choose not to engage with those systems. So we assume if there's an increase in people reporting one particular type of crime, there's also going to be an increase of more of people reaching out for support. So we need to ensure that if that crime were to be introduced, we have the foundations and supports surrounding them to do that in a safe manner. The second thing we've talked about is prioritising the funding of primary prevention and early intervention programs, services and education campaigns to stop the violence before it begins so that we can really change the culture of gendered violence in New South Wales. We really see violence as a preventable issue. Research shows that if we invest enough in changing the attitudes and cultures, norms and beliefs in society that create violence supportive attitudes, then we can really reduce and finally, at some point in the next few decades, end gendered violence, which is the world that I'd like to see. So I think as well as investing in legislative reforms like this, we need to make sure that the funding exists for the whole of community prevention type activities, which we know are vital to creating those longer term changes. We want to see an immediate priority on working collaboratively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations in addressing the devastating impact of domestic and family violence on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in New South Wales. There have been concerns raised by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations about potential unintended consequences of these reforms if they were to be introduced in New South Wales. Aboriginal people in Australia are some of the most incarcerated people in the world, not just in Australia, but in the world. So the figures are very high of people who are criminalised. Unfortunately, there's also high levels of people being misunderstood as to being the primary aggressor or the main person using violence in a relationship, and significant support and training is necessary in the police force to address that, such as co-responder models where direct services who are specialists in that area respond alongside police, and those are looking to be piloted next year, which we're really excited about. But there's lots to be done in this space to make sure that we are really prioritising and co-designing with Aboriginal communities so that solutions are not imposed on them, but are really coming from community because they know what works best for their communities. We need to substantially increase investment in ongoing education and training of police and the judiciary in how to effectively and appropriately police and prosecute domestic and family violence crimes, including non-physical abuse. So this is, this type of violence is not new, but it is certainly challenging for people in the police force to cope with. And the training, we believe, is not sufficient to provide people with, particularly general duties officers, to be providing a best practice response. As you saw from the member in the lived expertise survey, evidence on the ground is that it's not working well. So we really need to invest in training, but also monitor that training and how it's implemented to make sure that it's really hitting the ground well and that it's being performed by officers in the best way possible. Number 5 is to prioritise a thorough consultation process with the specialist domestic and family violence sector, with leaders and leading organisations representing marginalised groups and people with lived expertise. As I said, in Scotland, they saw a really long consultation process, and we would like to see that in New South Wales too, because it's a very complex area of legislation, and we need to make sure that there aren't any consequences that lead to over-criminalisation of some people. The law needs to work for all settings as well, for care settings of people who are aged or have disabilities, for minors. It needs to be right so that it can create safer communities. And our 6th recommendation is to implement changes to the AVO legislation, so the protection orders, which will provide immediate protections to victim survivors. For example, defining domestic and family violence more extensively to include a breadth of coercive and controlling behaviours, while we continue to consult and discuss about the broader issue of criminalisation of coercive control. We really feel that if we change that protection order legislation and terminology to include some of the wording around coercive controlling behaviours and include financial abuse, for example, I think that we can quite quickly provide a broader support level to people in New South Wales who are experiencing this type of violence, while making sure that we're really getting it right over a longer term. And we really believe that we need to take a whole of government approach to responding and preventing domestic and family violence in New South Wales. So we need to be consulting with specialist sector experts with lived expertise, and we need to ensure that this plan is resourced, reviewed, monitored and evaluated. In New South Wales, we have a blueprint to respond to domestic and family violence, which is now expired, and there is a plan to start a new plan in alignment to the national plan. But we really are keen to see this as a whole of government approach, so that if victim survivors are to reach out for support through their school or through an aged care setting or through their workplace, that there are mechanisms to create those supports. We really see that it is up to all of us and the whole community to create justice, and that it's not only determined by the justice system, that we need to make sure that the responses are holistic. So that's a wrap, that's me, and a few thoughts around coercive control. I really invite you to reach out to me. My email address is there, renata@dvnewsouthwales.org.au. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, And thank you so much for your work.